Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Ryan Vest, Executive Editor of TNSR, and I'm here with our Editor-in-Chief, Sheena Chestnut Greitens. We're pleased to have joining us today two distinguished scholars from the George W. Bush Institute, Chris Walsh and Igor Khrestin. They, along with former U.S. Senator Cory Gardner, are authors of the article, U.S. Policy Toward North Korea, Quo Vadis, which is featured in Volume 8, Issue 4 of the journal. At the George W. Bush Institute, Chris is the Director of Global Policy, where he manages communications, evaluation, and public policy research projects that advance freedom and democracy in the world. Igor is the Senior Advisor for Global Policy, where he previously served as the Bradford M. Freeman Managing Director of Global Policy. Chris, Igor, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. It's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here.
Likewise, great to be here. Thank you.
Sheena, I'm excited to dig into this article as I know it's a topic near and dear to your heart, and a topic that certainly deserves more attention, especially right now.
Yeah, so I just wanted to get us started by asking a little bit about what led you to write the article in the first place. What made you decide that right now was a good moment to call for a reassessment and to do a reassessment of American policy toward North Korea? Was there a specific development or policy change that you think calls us to devote renewed attention to this issue?
Well, I'm happy to jump in first, Igor, and then hand it over to you. But I'll just say, from the Bush Institute's perspective, we've been working on North Korea for a very, very long time, specifically around the issues of freedom, democracy, and human rights. This goes all the way back more than a decade to 2014, when we had distinguished scholars here. One of our fellows here, Victor Cha, Ambassador Robert Gallucci, author a paper called Toward a New Policy and Strategy for North Korea, where really started talking about and orienting Bush Center work around this idea that human rights and security issues should be tied closely together. And then just more broadly, we've always been very supportive of North Korean refugees, North Korean freedom and democracy advocates and dissidents, and have really been a mission here to support them. So this is just a natural fit for us to continue talking about the work we've already been doing.
And let me add to that is that how we got involved in North Korea policy. Senator Gardner and I worked on his staff and on the subcommittee for East Asia and the Pacific, visited the Bush Institute in 2016. Sheena, you might remember you were there as well for an event with President Bush and others to tie those issues together. And this is one of those, as we say in the article, problems from hell that really does not go away as a U.S. foreign policy imperative. I think it's become a more acute of an issue as the North Koreans obviously have developed their nuclear and other missile capabilities, tied themselves much closer to the Russians after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and continue these grave human rights abuses. And then I think the other acute sort of development that put this a little bit more in sharper focus was the U.S. Strike against Iranian nuclear facilities. And I think it raised some questions about, is this one way to deal with the problem? It's an uncomfortable question. And so it'll be interesting to see how that develops as a policy choice for the United States, whether that ultimately moves the needle on solving that particular issue and whether it serves as a model for dealing with North Korea, or do we go back to the first Trump administration's approach of face-to-face meetings and trying to develop a personal rapport and seeing if that results into a policy development. So I think all of these issues, the confluence of those issues put together, I think made it for a good time to explore the topic, and we're grateful that you offered your pages first to do so.
Before we get into the current challenges you address in the article, can you walk us through the key historical events that set the scene for the current problems with North Korea? Maybe some of the moments that really drove U.S. policy choices?
I think, again, we go back to about sort of 30 years, roughly, give or take. And I think maybe we could even go back to 40 years, to 1985, go back and see sort of what the Reagan administration had to deal with. But as we draw those parallels and seeing how the transition happened between sort of the Kim dynasty, this is sort of the third generation, we see a thread there of North Korea really doing what they think is best, and the United States and others trying to play catch up. And of course, there's various moments, and we don't go into all of those, where we could have had certain breakthroughs and agreements were certainly reached in 1994 framework. There's other ones in 2008. But I think the reality we're ending up with is that North Korea had pursued a choice, and they, through various iterations and extracting various concessions from the United States and our allies, are moving forward with these technological breakthroughs that really serve one purpose, and that's regime preservation, which is what the Kim sort of dynasty has been all about since the end of the Korean War. And so that's really where we draw those kinds of parallels and really think, again, not casting aspersions to one administration or the other on one administration's approach, but really sort of drawing out the sort of elements that made this, at the end of the day, and I think we use the word, a failure of policy to really move the needle.
So I remember scholar Victor Cha, who I know has been involved with some of your reports in the past, calling North Korea the land of lousy choices, or land of lousy options, maybe it was. And that certainly has been the true for multiple U.S. administrations over the course of the last 30 years. In the article, you talk maybe more specifically, because it's more recent, about President Biden's term as a period in which there really were heightened tensions and escalation in terms of North Korean behavior and what North Korea was doing. Can you talk a little bit about what the consequences of that are to help us just go right up to where you set the stage today, and what you think, went awry in that period?
I think I remember that phrasing, and I think Victor may have used it in an article discussing, again, this very sensitive issue of the bloody nose strike, right? I think I remember that piece in the Washington Post that he wrote. And this is where, going back to the Biden administration, I don't think that administration made up its mind and how it really wanted, again, to move the needle on the policy. I think they tried to sort of say, okay, so we've got, the Obama administration strategic patience that didn't play out so well. You've got the Trump administration personal diplomacy deals were sort of offered, were taken back, and there were some possibilities of breakthrough that didn't happen. And I think they tried to find some middle ground there, but at the end didn't find a willing customer in the North Koreans on any of that. And so I think if I were to sort of characterize it, I would say it wasn't really a priority for that administration to really deal with the issue in one concerted way or another. That's not to say there weren't sort of strategies and attempts and these other types of things and trilateral sort of enhancements, and we had summits but I think as a issue set, it didn't solve the problem. Again, created some good trilateral mechanisms and had summits and other things, but really, and again, we go into that. Didn't move the needle partially because of, again, Sheena, to your phraseology, it's the land of lousy options. Whatever, using 2 to tango, 3 to tango, 6 to tango, depending on how you view, the period of the North Korea sort of issue. So there wasn't any of that, really.
In your article, you mentioned 3 goals for President Trump in his second term. The first has to do with, and you've mentioned this already in the podcast, the problem from hell, or North Korea's growing nuclear arsenal. The desired outcome for this problem is complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. But why is CVID the ultimate goal? And how does the threat of nuclear catastrophe affect the U.S. approach?
Well, for one, again, going back to our third co-author here, it is something that's enshrined into U.S. law. And I think we need to also be very cognizant that while, we don't want to get into a constitutional argument here, the president is the officer that conducts our foreign policy. The Hill shapes a lot of it through legislation and through sanctions, frankly, which has been sort of the go-to tool. And CVID is enshrined into U.S. laws as the goal of U.S. policy. And so we should keep that in mind. And that may change. The reality of it may be a little bit different, but if we really want to move the needle on the issue, that should really be the goal. And North Korea should meet its international commitments in that regard. And we should devise a policy that, again, helps achieve that outcome. And we should still, again, if we're looking for the safest sort of world for us and our allies, the ROK and the Japanese and others, then a nuclear-free North Korea is that. And they've agreed to that multiple times, both in bilateral agreements and, again, through international sort of mechanisms. So we shouldn't change that goal. Again, how we get there, the eventualities, the modalities of various agreements that move us towards that, those are different questions. And I think that's where we get into the issue of what the Trump administration would like to do and how they want to approach that problem. Do they go back to the Singapore, the Vietnam, all of these summits and ideas there that could have resulted in some forward movement? But again, the goal shouldn't change, partially because, again, it's enshrined into U.S. law and it's been a longstanding goal of U.S. policy, and it's one that we should keep pushing on.
I noticed that North Korea's ambassador, or the North Korean representative's speech at the UN recently, repeated some language from Kim Jong-un that basically said nuclear weapons are now in our constitution. And so it's a matter of our law and our constitution. And therefore, the South Korean suggestion that we continue to pursue denuclearization, in particular, pointing to the new South Korean president, was sort of very roundly rejected. So this seems like a real sticking point. And that brings me to, I guess, one of the other objectives that is outlined in your article, which has to do with the full enforcement of sanctions that are outlined, in various parts of U.S. law, including, as you have already mentioned, the North Korea Sanctions Policy Enhancement Act, which I think was passed in 2016, which is one of Senator Gardner's efforts. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, how you see sanction enforcement playing out and how much attention and prioritization has been given to that, and where you think you would like to see the current administration go in terms of its approach to sanctions enforcement.
As an old hill hand, sanctions is what we do. Is really, again, has become for better or for worse, the go-to tool to shape policy towards, again, especially adversarial regimes, and think that they, by enacting these again, very sensible and common sense sort of laws, that we might move the policy needle. That's not always the case. And North Korea is an example of that. In some ways, Iran is well as that. And in other ways, Russia is an example of that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because, again, there should be a price to pay for illegal behavior and for, frankly, behavior that shocks the conscience. But it takes time for sanctions to work, is one sort of, I guess, aspirational hope. And the second one is that it sends a message. It sends a message to say, hey, we're obviously not happy, and we could muster sort of other policy tools. In going back to XPA, what really the innovation behind that is it was done in a really bipartisan fashion. President Obama signed it into law. Republicans in Congress, like Senator Gardner's and others, and Ed Royce at the time was the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, were strongly sort of supportive of it. So that's one element of that was really helpful, is that it was a bipartisan statement, bicameral bipartisan statement of intent that the U.S. takes this problem seriously, and we have the tools to do it. It was also innovative in the sense is that it mandated, with what we call waivers, which, if you work on sanctions policy, that's a lot of that. The name of the game is what kind of, how much aperture you give the administration to implement certain things, whether you use may or shall or these kinds of sort of legalese or efforts. But at the end of the day, it imposed secondary sanctions. And what that means is that it said, hey, if you're helping the North Koreans evade these sanctions, you yourself will be sanctioned. Now, that implicated a lot of Chinese and other sort of entities that really was sort of, in a way, saying, hey, get tougher on the enablers of the regime. It also imposed cyber sanctions. Cyber was becoming, you remember the Sony hack and these other sort of elements that have only gotten a lot worse. I think North Korea is now sort of a hub of criminal cyber activity that targets U.S. and other institutions. And so it talked about those elements as well. And it also had a sensible approach, I would say, working in a bipartisan way to sort of humanitarian efforts, which are important. There's a lot of debate about should we provide some humanitarian assistance. And so it had carve-outs for organizations that were doing that kind of work, not the U.S. government, but sort of humanitarian gesture. So in a way, the bill was very helpful in that regard. But then it gave the administration the ability to use these tools, to use them aggressively. And I would argue they weren't used very aggressively. And I think we cite some work from Anthony Ruggiero and a few others, that say, hey, these tools could have been used much more effectively. They could have gone after bigger fish than they did, and could have really sort of sent the message to North Korea's enablers. But then there was a moment, I'm not going to necessarily say watershed, because things have come back, but COVID really, I think, changed the equation on some of this. If you look at North Korea's experiences, they self-isolated themselves from the world probably better than any other sanctions regime could have. And it didn't change Kim Jong-un's calculus. Not only that, here comes the war with Ukraine, and the Russians threw the regime a huge lifeline and provided fuel and food and all of these other elements that the sanctions regimes sought to shut off. I don't know the extent to which the scientific cooperation has been enhanced since the time of the Russian sort of involvement. I hope our intelligence community has a good track, but I think we're going to start seeing some fruits bear from that, because I think Kim Jong-un is not going to send 10 to 30,000, whatever number of men, they're sending to the battlefield, plus, all of the other ammunition and other things that the North Koreans are providing for nothing, right? That's not going to be the case. So again, all of these things change dramatically how I think we should approach the sanctions posture. So I think that this administration also has an opportunity to recast that, to look at bills like XPIA and other efforts. So there's another one called CATSA that had a North Korean element as well that I remember working on. So looking at all of these sanctions tools, working with Treasury, and in particular, I'll mention about enforcement, right? I mean, it really is one thing to put these things on paper and say you should do it. And it's much different to have, agencies like OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control, and others to be empowered to go after these people, to have the resources needed to do that. And so that's the back-end stuff that really also needs to be strengthened, and interagency teams are built. There's a sanctions coordinator position at state. All of these, again, interagency coordination issues come into play when you're trying to craft a sanctions regime, again, in hopes that it moves the policy outcome, which it doesn't always, regrettably. As much as I hope personally was involved in this, we want this to happen. It doesn't always happen.
So I'd like to pivot just a little bit to the third goal. And Chris, I think this is more along your area of expertise, but the third goal that you outlined in the article was to build on existing alliances, particularly by working to unify Japan and South Korea under a common purpose. How does the second Trump administration meaningfully build on the existing trilateral security cooperation framework, and what potential roadblocks might stand in their way?
Personally, what I would love to see, and I think what many of us would like to see in this relationship is, the economic, the security cooperation, that's all important, but to deepen the human rights component. And it was great to see that at least it got some rhetorical support at Camp David when this trilateral partnership was first launched. I think there's something that the Trump administration would desire here. I think it's an opportunity for burden sharing. The United States should be a global leader, no question. It should be championing human rights and democracy around the world, but it can't do it alone. It has to depend on its allies, its democratic allies. And if we can push Seoul and Tokyo to invest in global democracy infrastructure, I think that's a win-win. It takes some pressure off the United States. It shows the commitment of our allies to this type of thing. And really, I would love to see and would welcome a Korean or South Korean or Japanese National Endowment for Democracy. It would be very welcome. And I think some of the roadblocks are going to be unpredictability from Washington. That's going to affect how new leadership in South Korea and Japan do their calculus when it comes to how much does Washington have our back when it comes to security. And we need to have their back. I think it will be important for champions in the State Department, including Secretary Rubio, to try and make human rights, democracy, and freedom issues in the trilateral partnership a priority, or at least to make sure it's not forgotten or slips off the agenda. And I was encouraged to see things like, I believe it was in August, a joint statement from the trilateral partnership, Japan, South Korea, the United States, talking about this issue of illicit North Korean IT workers. It's a security issue for sure, giving access to North Korea to some sensitive information technologies, but also a human rights issue when you consider that these laborers are most likely against their will, getting funds that are funneled back to the Pyongyang illicitly, and are funding the nuclear weapons program. This is a tangible example of where the partnership can make a statement and intertwine these ideas of security and human rights and policy.
So I do want to come back to this idea of strengthening cooperation on democracy and human rights, because I think that plays a very important and distinctive role in the piece that you wrote for the Texas National Security Review. Before I get to that, one or two other things on the security front that I wanted to raise and ask you to reflect on. And one of them is that you mentioned in the article that no option to deal with the North Korean threat should be taken off the table. And you raised the idea of the bloody nose strategy, which we touched on earlier. So maybe for listeners, could you tell them a little bit about what that strategy is? How do you think that fits in a potential peace through strength approach to North Korea that the administration might be able to adopt? And how does that sync with the allies and partners cooperation that you were talking about just a moment ago?
I get all the easy ones. This one being among them. I think, again, we ought to be very careful and prudent about the use of the U.S. military, and I think it should be an option of the last resort. But again, I come back to the precedent in some ways. I use that term carefully. That was laid down in June 22nd, I believe, with the strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. If you are looking to move the needle to again solve the problem, again, a big word, but at least to comprehensively move sort of towards the denuclearization, I think Kim Jong-un needs to understand the price will be hefty, and it's an existential choice of, again, regime survival, because those are kind of the bonds with which they operate. In fact, going back to some of the summitry here in Singapore, security guarantees were on the table that the United States would promise that it would not attack North Korea in any single way. So it is a point of leverage. Again, I'm not advocating for any sort of strikes here. I think, again, going back to the article that Victor wrote and others at the time, 2018, the repercussions could be very serious. North Korea does have capabilities, does have an ICBM program. They do target American cities. These things should not be taken lightly. That's why we have a very robust missile defense program in places like Alaska and California and others that seeks to avoid those threats. So pushing the button on these issues would be very cautious. But we do need to also reflect that North Korea does not shy away from using military force against its neighbors, against other sort of targets, and that also needs to be taken into consideration. That's besides all of the cooperations provided to other bad guys like the Syrians and the Iranians and so forth. So these are some of the things that the U.S. policymakers should consider, again, within an array of options, is to say the problem is getting worse, the capabilities are advancing. You only have to listen to the speeches to understand who they're targeted against and who they consider to be their primary adversary. So before the problem gets to the stage where it's not at all solvable, let's put it this way, we need to utilize some other options in our toolbox. So it's about having those capabilities. It's not about necessarily using them against a specific target. And again, the impediments would be the similar ones to the ones that were faced in the Iranian scenario. These things are very deep. They're dispersed. We know where they are, but all of these things, I'm not a military planner, but they must be very carefully considered, and then the response needs to be carefully considered, not just against us, but against our allies and our assets, both on the peninsula. We have 28,500 troops in South Korea, and we've got a lot more in Japan and Okinawa and on the mainland. And so we all need to consider all of those options. So again, not advocating, but keeping that on the table, I think would be prudent and wise if we're looking to solve a problem.
Recently, China and Russia have deepened their ties with North Korea, including North Korea's willingness to help Russia in its war in Ukraine. This has not only given Pyongyang more leverage with a UNSC member, but also aided its missile programs. How does this added dimension affect the challenge of holding North Korea accountable? And how might the U.S. need to adjust its course in light of these newer or updated relationships?
Well, I can give Igor a break. I know he's been handling the tough ones, but I'm sure he'd probably like to weigh in on this as well. But let me just say, so you have this somewhat unprecedented cooperation between some of these authoritarian powers, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and specifically with the three powers in Northeast and Southeast Asia. And I don't want to overstate how serious a challenge it is, because I think it is a serious challenge, but you don't want to overstate it. But I think because of that relationship and the support that North Korea is receiving, material, military technology, food from Russia and from China, there's a lot less incentive for them to come to the table. And not only are they providing political cover at international organizations for North Korea, China, and Russia, but also helping them to evade sanctions. But again, I don't want to overstate it. And I think of the fable, I think of the scorpion and the frog, where the scorpion gets on the back of the frog and says, "Take me across the river, I promise not to sting you." And in the middle of the river, the scorpion stings the frog and they both drown. Because it's the nature of these regimes to distrust, to want to hoard power for themselves, to be paranoid about their adversaries, to not have good friends. And so I think the way that the United States can counter this relationship and try to weaken it is to feed on that. One way is for robust support for a democratic ally in Ukraine that is fighting for its life against one of the pillars of this alliance in Russia. And we know that North Korea and Russia are tightly aligned, Russia providing needed and vital ammunition and troops. So how does that relationship change if U.S. strategy shifts to ensure that Ukraine wins that war, and the alliance between the defense and mutual defense and support alliance between Russia and North Korea is no longer as valuable? I would also say there's a long game here. All of these regimes have a shared weakness, and that is their people. Make no mistake, they're terrified of the people that they brutalize and rule over. And the ultimate solution to these challenges is for policies that make these governments more accountable to their people. So I think it's in the long-term strategic interest of the United States to really focus on improving the human conditions in these countries, and that can be through statements of solidarity, so rhetoric, humanitarian aid where it's feasible and it can be monitored. I would say it's empowering the freedom activists and democracy advocates from all of these countries, and that can be through training, giving them platforms to tell their stories and explain to the American people why that matters, and providing resources. And I do think of a report that the Bush Institute and the Center for Strategic and International Studies just released called Shuttered Borders, that looks at the experience of COVID in North Korea, and that a point to leverage and to exploit is this what seems to be growing frustration within North Korea towards the government, something that would be unthinkable even 5-10 years ago, where people are openly in safe spaces still voicing their disgust and annoyance with the regime. Through supporting refugees, freedom advocates who can get information and resources back into the country, this seems like a pressure point that we should be leveraging as the United States.
Let me pick up on that point because I wanted to turn to the question of human rights because they really are a crucial part of your article and of this conversation, including under U.S. law, as we've talked about already. So one of the challenges that is posed by Russia's close coordination now with North Korea is that Russia, as a permanent 5 member of the United Nations Security Council, has some ability to shield North Korea, including one of the recent things that it did, which was to block the UN sanctions investigation and enforcement mechanism and prevent that from being renewed at the United Nations. So given that international landscape, right, and the relationship that exists now between Russia and North Korea, I think that is a really important time to then revisit the United States toolkit and United States policy on North Korean human rights. So before we switch to talking about what exactly those tools are and how the U.S. should start moving the levers, for listeners who might be relatively newer to the conversation on North Korea, can you just talk a little bit about why North Korea's human rights record is so dismal, I think in the words of one of the UN commissions in 2014, without parallel in the contemporary world? Just unpack that a little bit for our listeners to kind of set the scene before we talk about what we can do about it.
You took the words right out of my mouth with unparalleled in today's world. So you're talking about a regime, a totalitarian dictatorship in North Korea it's almost out of a fiction novel. It's so terrible, it's hard to imagine. And coming from a free society like the United States, it's really difficult to wrap your mind around a regime where there essentially are no political rights, no civil liberties, no ability to gather, no ability to vote and choose your leaders. You work for the government, not the other way around. In fact, Freedom House, the international democracy and freedom watchdog, does their annual Freedom in the World survey where they rate all of these political rights, civil liberties. And North Korea is perennially at the bottom. It falls into the worst of the worst. So just to give a flavor, but not exhaustive list of the issues here, information is completely controlled. The only information that you will receive as a citizen of North Korea is government propaganda. Now, there are efforts from NGOs, South Korea, the United States to get information into the country. But if you are caught with some of this foreign information, foreign media, and this could be a soap opera, you're eligible to be publicly executed for watching a soap opera. You have city-sized political prison camps where up to 3 generations of your family, even if they're innocent, could go if someone in your family commits a thought crime or political crime. It is a place, as you said, unparalleled. That's hard for someone who lives in a free society to imagine. These are serious human rights abuses that I don't think morally or practically the United States can stand by and allow to be continued.
So to keep going on that thought, you talk a lot about human rights and the U.S. government acting in solidarity with those fighting the regime. My question, I guess, is how can the Trump administration or legislators on Capitol Hill, those that work in the State Department, how can we work to promote accountability while protecting the human rights of those that are opposing the regime and defectors? So
I think there's good news on this front. I think sometimes we hear terms like human rights, freedom, democracy, and the instinct is to say the American people don't care so much about that. I disagree completely. I think the American people are compassionate and generous. And yes, it's sometimes difficult for them to make the connection when they're struggling, understandably, with domestic problems and issues at home, talking about kitchen table issues, why they should care about stuff that's happening thousands of miles from their houses where they live. But some recent public opinion research from both the Ronald Reagan Institute and the Vandenberg Coalition show that that's not the case. Actually, many Americans, despite talks of isolationism, care about U.S. engagement in the world. Majorities actually care for moral reasons that the United States should be supporting human rights and democracy around the world. So I think it's good for the Trump administration, for Congress, to give the American people what they want, something that's popular and something that they can deliver on. And so I would say it starts as simple as building a foundation. Set a vision for the American people about why United States involvement in the world matters, why supporting freedom and democracy is a good thing, how it protects us at home, how it promotes prosperity and opportunity for our businesses and for trade, and how it makes the world more stable so that we don't have to worry about security threats. I always think of the Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov, who said, "A country that doesn't respect the rights of its own people won't respect the rights of its neighbors." And I think you see that in this CRINC alliance and in North Korea in particular. But, it's as simple as the White House, it's as simple as Congress welcoming freedom advocates from North Korea, but from other CRINC countries to the Oval Office to testify. And this is happening, but it should happen more, to tell their stories, to outline how their struggles for freedom and liberty, how human rights abuses affect Americans, and to give them this platform to explain the issue. I would also say the State Department can play a role here that can galvanize people's opinion and spark action. And that would be by issuing human rights atrocities declarations. As Olivia Enos from the Hudson Institute has pointed out, this can spur some action. We have seen this through the Uyghurs in China. We have seen this in Burma. And what it does is it can inspire legislation with sanctions components that target human rights abusers. It can inspire other countries to do the same. This is a powerful but really small lift thing that the United States can do. And lastly, in fact, the Bush Institute just did this recently. It would be great to see, in partnership with government, although it doesn't have to be that way, bringing together freedom advocates from around the world and get them thinking about how the struggle for freedom is not individual, but a joint effort. The bad guys in China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are working together. So how can the good guys do the same thing? And there are problems to solve that. There's resources are scarce. How do you share the spotlight? But these are the types of conversations that should be happening. That should be a policy effort to push back in these small ways against the regime in North Korea.
Maybe I can add just one thing to what Chris said, which is important. One specific: the Congress should reauthorize the North Korea Human Rights Act. It hasn't been reauthorized in a couple of years. It's a busy time right now in Washington, as you all know, shutting down the government and whatnot. But it is very important to do that because it shows that we care about the issue. And one of the examples that Chris mentioned that galvanized that piece of legislation and others was, President Bush welcoming the author of the Aquariums of Pyongyang into the Oval Office. And based on that experience, really caring about the condition of the North Korean people. And through that legislation, we've gained a great colleague that you all know, Joseph Kim, who's a North Korean SKP himself, and many other lives were impacted and saved. This is why when the North Korea Sanctions Policy Enhancement Act was developed, the human rights was a central component of that. In fact, Senator Gardner read from the Commission Inquiry's report on the Senate floor passages about people's nails getting ripped out, just the horrible atrocities. Fortunately, what's happened is that we've gotten inured to that kind of thing because of the state of the world right now, because of the wars, because of everything, and it doesn't tend to be top of mind, but it should be. It should be a central point. I think this is what the piece makes clear of U.S. policy towards North Korea, and we would encourage the administration to look at those things and to galvanize. There's a North Korean envoy position at the State Department that is vacant. It'll probably, I think, likelihood it'll remain vacant given the administration's position on special envoys and these types of things. That's something that they should look at. I'm not necessarily advocating for that position, but a focus within state and other agencies to that. And again, integrating that as an element of North Korea policy, not just looking at the hard power elements of the issue, which are, again, also incredibly challenging, right? And in fact, again, looking out broader into the CRINC issue set. Chris and Joseph were a great piece on this. I mean, multiple administrations have struggled with the fact that, we have these considerations where, with China, we deal on the economy and sort of other things, and human rights tends to fall by the wayside or be stovepiped into some process that isn't really central. And I think that's not a wise strategy there. So.
Well, I've had the chance in the course of my work to come into contact with a number of the North Korean refugees and defectors who've come and resettled in the United States under the North Korean Human Rights Act, the legislation that you mentioned. And what was actually striking to me and what jumped out in conversation every time was how deeply many of them have internalized the values of freedom and democracy. And there are survey results that actually corroborate that, some of which you all have been involved in. So definitely understand and I'm glad you're calling our attention to the link between these individual people's stories, the human element of the tragedy and the challenge that North Korea presents, and the high level policy decisions that are in front of the administration right now. So I'm really glad to be able to link those two in the way that you just did, and agree with you that really is important. I wanted to give you a chance before we close, just to ask if there's anything else that we missed or overlooked in the course of our conversation that you wanted to highlight about the article today, or about where we stand in the current landscape and the current moment. Any last words you want to leave with our listeners today?
I can just go back to one point that Chris had emphasized now. It's these theaters are linked. The North Korea problem set is not just a North Korea problem set. It's a growing problem of collusion and alignment between regimes that seek to undermine. And again, this is a term that gets used a lot and the definitions vary, but the post-World War global order, liberal world order, whatever you want to call it, that the United States built, that's based on certain principles, and that is being these regimes seek to destroy it. So looking at the problem holistically, if you look at Ukraine as a problem of Ukraine, that is not a wise way of looking at it. And prioritizing resources for another theater because you think the Ukraine theater is a European problem, not call out people or but this is a line of thinking, is not wise, because these problems come back and they worsen and they lead to problems that become worse. And so my sort of closing, I guess, argument would be to look at the North Korea problem set as a set of a larger symptom of what does the United States do now in this? We've gotten past the Cold War peace dividend for whatever it was. How do we rebuild United States power to keep, again, our place in the world, but also to make sure it's safe for people like the North Koreans, and looking at these problems as an intertwined set of very fundamental issues that U.S. policymakers need to be considering and need to be very serious about in where we are with the world. So I'll close with that, Chris.
And the only thing, nothing new, but to emphasize something, Sheena, that you brought up regarding the North Korean Human Rights Act, which, again, to go back to a point I made earlier, is something that has tremendous bipartisan support. It was renewed through the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations. Couldn't get much more different than that, and still something that was wildly popular. But also, in the story of someone we talked about, Joseph Kim, really shows the value of what a small amount of resources and something that's popular and something that has bipartisan support can do. We talked about Joseph Kim. This is a kid who grew up homeless on the streets of North Korea, risked everything, his life, to escape, made his way through China, came to the United States, inspired by the movie Rambo, no less. How much more American can you get? And comes here and makes a new life for himself. And not only a new life for himself, but champions American values and wants to share those of freedom, democracy, human rights, and share those with his people back in North Korea, works for a former president of the United States, and is a valued member of his colleagues and the community here in Texas. That's the power of something like the North Korean Human Rights Act, and it has done this for other North Koreans who came here wanting to live in freedom. Security is so important, but so is the human rights and freedom and democracy elements.
Well, Chris, Igor, it's been really wonderful talking with you today, and we're glad you joined us. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for joining us on Horns of a Dilemma from the Texas National Security Review. Our guests today have been Chris Walsh and Igor Khrestin, authors of the article U.S. Policy Toward North Korea, Quo Vadis, which, as always, can be accessed for free on our website, tnsr.org. Chris, Igor, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Sheena.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Sheena. Great being here.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen. and you can always find more of our work at tnsr.org. Today's episode was produced by TNSR Digital and Technical Manager Jordan Morning and made possible by the University of Texas System. This is Ryan Vest and Sheena Chestnut Greitens. Thank you for listening.